Hey there, I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. So when we were pitched this next author that I'm going to chat with for Bookends, I could not say yes fast enough. My best friend from undergrad actually wrote his master's thesis about Alan Hollinghurst, and Alan is here today to discuss his latest novel, Our Evenings. I remember super vividly the first time I picked up one of Alan's books. It was The Line of Beauty, his 2004 work about 1980s gay culture in Britain. It's the AIDS crisis. It's the Thatcher era. It really plunged me into that world. I raced through reading it while hanging out on my parents' back deck back in September 2020. I was just so riveted and consumed by the story. The Line of Beauty won the Booker Prize in 2004, which was a massive deal. It was the first time that a book centered on the gay experience had won the award. But The Line of Beauty was Alan's fourth book, and he was just doing what he'd always done. Writing from a gay perspective about the lives of gay characters and the world that constrains them and their choices. Alan continues to do that in his new novel, Our Evenings. It chronicles the life of a mixed-race actor in the UK, from his time in public school, or as we would say in Canada, private school, in the 1960s, to his later years during the Brexit referendum and the COVID lockdown of 2020. Alan Hollinghurst joined me from our CBC studio in London. Hi, Alan. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Mattea. It's a pleasure.
Now, I want to start off by talking about the main character and narrator of Our Evenings, David Wynne. For folks who haven't read the book, can you tell us a bit about him? Who is he?
Well, as you said in your introduction, he's a mixed-race young man born in 1948 to a white English mother with whom he lives in a little Berkshire market town, and of a Burmese father whom he's never met. I suppose Dave is, like a lot of my protagonists, he is something of an outsider in due course by dint of his sexuality, but he has this further unignorable outsiderliness in this context, which is that of his race.
Yeah, from my knowledge of your previous work, again, the sort of outsider queer protagonist is something that you've always been drawn to. But this is, I believe, the first time that you've written from the perspective of someone who is also marginalized based on race. There have been certainly discussions about race in your prior work, but we're not seeing those discussions take place from the point of view of that person who's racialized. What made you want to write from this perspective in Our Evenings?
I'd be more and more interested by this question of seeing life from a different racial perspective. And indeed, it seems to me a fascinating and increasingly urgent question in our present culture. You know, this country had appalling race riots erupting within the last 2 or 3 months. And it was really a question of finding out how I could do it. So I thought the mixed race thing would be quite an interesting way of doing it. And the person could be, as it were, partly me, but with this further significant difference. And by choosing Burma as his other sort of cultural, racial background, I was choosing something which doesn't really have that attendant literature, and indeed is very little known about. So I thought it would be both an intrinsically interesting and a tactful way of approaching this question.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that there's a lot of yourself in David. When you're speaking about the sort of Burmese element and making him biracial, was there any sort of, I'm wondering, what aside from the fact that there wasn't this existing body of literature being written by a Burmese community in the UK, was there anything that you were specifically drawn to as reference materials, perhaps, that informed developing that aspect of David's experience?
I mean, in a way, there are very personal things, because I grew up in a little town rather like the one described in the book, and I had a close friend at my primary school, so between the ages of 4 and 7, who was in fact half Burmese. He had a Burmese mother and a white English father, and this boy and I, we used to walk to school every day. It never struck me at the time, of course, but he was the first person of colour that I ever knew.
One thing that's interesting about this novel, I guess, as well, and again, your prior work often does this, is it's like this idea of it being written from the first-person perspective, that we're not sort of the observer looking down at the life of David, but that we're inhabiting what it would be like to be this person who is the one brown person, essentially, in this market town, as you say. How did you kind of construct his perspective and his world? There's such rich detail, particularly in the portions of the book that are talking about his early life, the countryside and the market town where he lives with his mother. It sounds like you're drawing a lot, perhaps, from your own perspective and own experiences there.
Yes, I am doing that, and perhaps writing in the first person made that more natural. It seemed to me from the start that writing in the first person was going to be essential, but I felt, especially writing from a different racial perspective, that to have written it in the third person would have put me in a position of presumed omniscience, and to write from the first person would be to quite justifiably withhold all sorts of things, to admit to the limitations of my own knowledge. And because I was going back into territory that I remembered myself, I felt that my own sort of memoir-like access to school days and university days and so on could all feed into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to almost move chronologically through some of that, because one thing that's interesting, I've spent, I would say, not a massive amount of time in England, but enough time in England that when you say market town, or when you're talking about the sort of physical landscape of Oxford University, I've seen it, I know what it is. We are a North American show, for better or for worse, so that's something that perhaps not all of our listeners will have seen themselves. What is this English market town? What does that mean? Because that's not something we really have in Canada in the same way.
No, you probably don't. Well, market towns are really usually a town not necessarily of any great size, though they could become very prosperous, which would be at the centre of a largely agricultural area. So it's a place to which livestock and so on would be brought. They almost invariably have a market square in the middle where sales of livestock and produce and so on would take place. So they're really places to which farmers and people in the outlying areas would come in to shop and to trade their own goods. And of course their status has rather changed since I was a boy, and people do all their shopping by car in out-of-town malls and everything. So market towns now in a sort of rather derelict and sorry state. But certainly when I was a boy, they were thriving places.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely the sort of milieu that we come into at the beginning of the novel, that David's being raised by his English mother, as you mentioned, in this town. They're this little family of two at the beginning, and they're incredibly close. I'll want to speak later about David going to boarding school and what that does with his relationship with his mother and what that does to his development. But they're quite inseparable at the beginning. What did you want to explore here about the bond between mother and son, maybe particularly about the bond between mother and queer son, because that's a specific type of relationship in itself?
Yes, I knew that was going to be a kind of central element of the book. Really, I wanted to look at the extraordinary kind of emotional power that a mother can have over a son. In this book, there's a great deal which is unsaid, unexamined between them. The bond is a very strong one, but mother has this ability to suppress a subject, to make it unspeakable. So, for instance, what happened in Burma, what happened with her fling with this unknown man, is something which is never really discussed, much as Dave wants to know about his father. Matters of sexuality have become more pressing to Dave during his teens, are also something which are not discussed. And, of course, this comes to a fascinating head when the mother's own sex life takes an unexpected turn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was something that was fascinating, that there's this thing that Dave and his mother have in common in a way that still can't be totally discussed in the open, even as she's living with another woman, and they have this community of other lesbians or women who are attracted to women. It's kind of ambiguous. There's this ambiguity in what is not being said there.
That was very much sort of, not at the time, but in retrospect, I saw part of the atmosphere of particularly lesbian life at that time. And I remember vividly two couples, women who lived together. One couple ran a little tea shop that we often used to go to. Another ran a sort of newsagent and tobacconist in the town. They were always spoken of together. They did everything together. What we will never know, of course, is just what, in those days, people thought, felt, presumed about sexuality. Were people all thinking, of course, they're lesbians, or did the idea never enter their head? But obviously it was easier for lesbians then to live together as companions or whatever, in a way that I think it would have been much harder for two men to live together, and I think that would have attracted a great deal of comment and censure. So, yes, I wanted Avril, Dave's mother, when they're no longer sharing their evenings at home after he's gone off to boarding school. She's lonely and she's by herself. She works makes her living as a dressmaker. And one of her customers, a rather overwhelming divorcee called Esme Croft, is someone who she obviously immediately feels some sort of excitement about. Dave is away at school, so he doesn't know what's going on. But during his absence, the relationship between his mother and Esme develops until a point at the end of his school life when they move in together, and Dave is in the throes of the first hopeless passion as a student at Oxford. And nothing really has been said by any of them, but they obviously all sort of know what's going on. And the first half of the book really concludes in this big scene where they all come out to each other.
Mm-hmm. One thing that we've been mentioning and dancing around so far in our conversation is this boarding school experience, which also forms a huge part of Dave's development as a young boy becoming a man. David is a Hadlow exhibitionist, which is the term that they use at this school, Bampton, that he attends, for a scholarship kid who's attending this elite boarding school. The Hadlow family are this family of wealthy philanthropists who sponsor this scholarship. What is it like for him being this person who's at this elite boarding school with all of these sons of the landed gentry, and he's this, mixed race kid who is, as so many queer people are when they're younger, sort of accused of being gay or assumed to be gay, but he's not out. What is that environment like for him?
Well, he's obviously come from a fairly humble background, but he's very clever. So he wins this exhibition and finds himself projected into a quite different kind of social world from that of the nice little school that he's gone to in the town before as a day boy. He finds himself exposed to racial prejudice in a way that he hadn't been before. And, of course, he's in a school with hundreds of other adolescent boys, so the kind of sexual questions and tauntings and hidden passions and so on form very much part of the atmosphere. The Hadlows are, yes, they're a family of wealthy, sort of leftish philanthropists, cultural benefactors, and they take an interest in the boys who each year win this exhibition to the school. Dave is someone who's grown up without a father, so the Hadlows take a sort of quasi-parental role in his life. They have a horrible son who's also a contemporary of Dave's at the school, Giles, who's a bully and obviously very much resents this brown-faced boy who's cleverer than him, and he's always beating Dave up and being generally horrible and sort of racially abusive to him.
Giles, to me, represented a sort of type of student, I would say, that I've seen represented in other media that depicts the English boarding school, that I've certainly met a few of these types of people in my life as well. Yeah. I didn't have to go to school with them, however, so there's at least a bit of a remove there. There's this specific kind of person, a lot of whom become politicians in England, it seems, as Giles eventually does, who is this sort of son of the landed gentry that wants to lord power over even the other students in the boarding school from a very young age. Was Giles, in your mind, meant to represent a certain general type of person? And I'm wondering, again, for a Canadian audience that's not perhaps as familiar with the culture of the English public school, who is the average student at this school? Where do they end up after leaving school?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think that they probably go into the professions mainly, and they become all kinds of things. I mean, there's a school reunion much later on in the book where you see some people, such as Giles, have gone on to become leading sort of right-wing Tory politicians. Others have become successful lawyers and so forth. I think the law, business would be likely to be the kind of destinations of most of these people, and probably the kind of family backgrounds from which they themselves came. The bully is, I'm afraid, a sort of perennial feature of the English public school, probably not only the public school experience. And I wanted Giles almost to retain that quality of the schoolboy bully from sort of beginning to end of the book. And he's a recurrent sort of problem and obstacle who's forgotten for decades and then pops up again in some alarming way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what he represented to me reading is I felt like, well, this is, the sort of archetype of the boy who goes to Eton, who goes to Balliol College, Oxford, and then enters Tory politics. There's been, and you can't even say which specific person I'm talking about because there's been so many.
Exactly. No, I mean, you really put your finger on the makeup of so much of the sort of high Tory personnel over the last century, really. I mean, I didn't want him, when he becomes a politician, to be too closely resembling anybody else, but he's someone of sort of furious self-importance, really, throughout the book.
Mm-hmm. You've talked about David as being this outsider figure. He's somebody that has a bit of foot in the world of the wealthy because he's been to this boarding school. He goes to Oxford. He knows all of these people. But he, by dint of his sexuality, his class background, his race, can't quite enter that world. What draws you to this subject and to writing these outsider characters who are kind of partway into that world of wealth and power, but not quite ever there?
I do seem to have been drawn to that, yes. I suppose it's actually quite a useful kind of position for the novelist, and your protagonist, especially if the book is written in the first person, has to be someone of intelligence and perceptions. So I think the cleverness of the narrator is essential, and his powers of observation. He goes into a new sort of social dimension, if you like, with antennae quickened for everything that's particular and different about it, but also retains within him a sense of the values of the world from which he's come. So he forms a very useful kind of tool for observation. And, I wanted to write something about race and race itself as an excluder. So it's important to me that Dave is clever, bright, optimistic. I didn't want to write a victim narrative in which he's constantly sort of crushed by circumstance. But he keeps on coming up against these ceilings or walls which prevent his advance. And when he's at school, he discovers that he has this gift for acting. At Oxford, he thrives doing this and has a tremendous success in his last term, playing Mosca in Ben Jonson's Volpone, an enormous, very demanding part. And a great career on the stage should be ahead of him. But it's not to be because of his appearance. And indeed, his race is so very vaguely understood by British people that he's constantly being cast in these tiny little sort of cameo roles of any kind of East Asian person.
Mm-hmm. There's so much in there that I want to pull on. David's career as an actor, I think, is something that's so fascinating. I want to talk first, though, before getting into this acting career stuff, about Oxford, that, David does make it to Oxford. He's there in the 1970s. I understand you attended Oxford yourself. What was Oxford like at that time? Because I've only known the Oxford of the 2010s and 2020s, which is somewhat of a different beast, I think.
I think it is. Yeah, well, David's a bit earlier than me, so he's there kind of in the late 60s. I went to Oxford in 1972 and did 2 degrees there, so I spent a long time there. I'd known the town itself ever since I was a child, having grown up nearby, and in some, I hope not arrogant way, somehow I always assumed that was where I was going to go. What was it like? I suppose it was much more conventional then. It was much more dominated by people from public school, that is to say private school backgrounds, than it is now. It was also hugely more male. It was really only after I had left in 1975 that a move towards making all the colleges co-educational slowly began. So there were all kinds of sort of social imbalance built into the structure of university life at that time. I wasn't generally very happy as an undergraduate, I think, because I hadn't come out. I was prone to these terrible passions for completely unsuitable and unavailable people. So the whole thing was really steeped for me in a mood of sort of longing and anxiety.
Mm-hmm. There was something that you had said in an interview that I was reading, speaking about, this sense of being closeted at Oxford and then the subsequent liberation of going to London, where you mentioned there was a gay student society at Oxford during your time, but you would not have wanted to associate with any of the people in it.
Yes, that's such a snobbish and awful thing to say, but I thought,
What about, because it's funny, in a much different time period, I attended university in Canada in the later half of the 2010s. And I recall feeling actually exactly the same way about the people that were involved in the Gay Student Society. I was like, these people are for me, it was that they were far too earnest, and I was a little bit thrown. What was it about that social environment of these people who were the out gay students at Oxford that made you go, no, I'll wait for London, thank you very much?
Yes, they were earnest, they were strident, and they weren't very attractive. I think I thought that joining the gay soc or something would be a sort of overture to wonderful sexual adventures and so on. And then I thought, actually, did I imagine having sexual adventures with these people? Probably not. So I was sort of partly frightened of it and kept my own counsel.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn to the subject of acting and the theater and the role that plays in this novel, because David, from a very young age, is so attracted to it. He's drawn in. Why does he gravitate towards acting?
I think it seemed to be a nice sort of figure for his way of adapting himself to new environments, fitting in, becoming, in a sense, someone else, with a consciousness of playing a role. He discovers soon after he goes to this big boarding school that he has this gift for mimicry, imitating other masters, and because he's so good at it, this actually gives him a kind of popularity. And I think he early on finds a degree of liberation in acting, a sort of an escape from himself and a fulfillment of himself at the same time. And I wanted this to sort of increasingly take over his life. In a way, he's being put through this sort of top-class, expensive English education at a private school, and he wins a scholarship to Oxford. Everything is tending towards turning him into an exemplary little Englishman. But he has this other gift which is rather at odds with this sort of career path that this education might have seemed to set him on. And I mean, I don't want to say too much about it, but the book is in two halves. In the first half is all about his education, and that sort of climaxes in a great sort of compound crisis for him and sets him on a completely new course for the second half of the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this experience of Dave moving to London and coming into this milieu where he is not the only brown face in the company of actors, that it's very racially diverse, that he's meeting openly gay people for the first time. This is a story of, you go to London from the small town and you find this kind of liberation. There's so much media that deals with this, and we see it in North America about going to New York, going to Toronto. I'm wondering, for you as a younger person, leaving your background of having lived in a market town growing up, having attended boarding school in Oxford, what was it like for you to move to London and kind of experience perhaps your own version of this coming out and coming into a community that was a lot more diverse than what you'd been around prior?
Yeah, I mean, it was very different from the Oxford Gay Soc we were talking about before. It was tremendously exciting, almost alarming amount of kind of possibility, moving from that smaller world of Oxford to London. And yes, immediately feeling you were in a world which had different values as well as different possibilities. The thing that so many people have written about, the beautiful anonymity of moving to a very large city where nobody knows you, and that sense of being able in a way to invent a new destiny for yourself in a different setting. And I think, that is something I've certainly written about in several of my books, and is almost a cliche of the gay experience of people coming from the provinces to find themselves, lose themselves and find themselves in the big city.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that was so interesting to me about this novel is it takes place over such a long span of time, going from the 1960s into 2020. And in that time, there's been so much change, both with the laws on the books around homosexuality, right? That we're going from a time where homosexuality was still criminalized to a time where, we don't even just have civil unions. We have actual full marriage equality in a lot of the West. And there's so many ways in which society's attitudes around homosexuality have changed. How does that sort of play out in the book, as David becomes perhaps more comfortable in his own sexual identity And the character, I would say, of his romantic relationships changes with the times as a result of some of these societal changes that are happening in the background.
Yes, you're right. The book does cover a huge time span, which seems to be something I've been more and more drawn to in my recent books. I mean, it struck me very much the world that my first book, The Swimming Pool Library, sort of emerged into in 1988 is also unrecognisably different from the one into which this book is appearing. And it's been an interesting thing to someone who's been persistently writing about queer life through this period, how live the subject is and how you're writing about something which keeps changing and developing. The extreme sort of tensions to do with coming out and so forth in the early part of the book are sort of unimaginable in the world of the end of the book. A lot of his life is sort of skipped over in this book, and it has I hope, a slightly disconcerting tempo for the reader, because the education first half moves very slowly within the confines of a life which is contained by school and university terms and years and so forth, without a clear sense of the future. The second half is much freer, and he's on his own and he's out in the world. And I also wanted just to create that experience which everybody, alas, finds as they get older, of time just speeding up. So there's a lot of his romantic life which we don't know about, but we see him having his first affair with somebody he meets at a party, someone he wouldn't have thought that he'd be attracted to at all, but with whom he feels this instant kind of sexual bond. And they have a happy but perhaps not totally satisfying time for several years before he has his affair with Hector, the black actor, which is sort of much more intense but much more demanding and sort of perilous for him, I think. So we see two things sort of being tried and going wrong. In the latter part of the book, the time in which he's actually writing the book, he's settled down very happily and got married to another man 10 years younger than himself. So he's writing from a point of view of domestic, romantic contentment, which he absolutely couldn't have anticipated in the earlier parts of the story.
Mm. You know, speaking of the passage of time, you know, we're speaking about 20 years since you won the Booker Prize for The Line of Beauty in 2004. And at the time, there was a lot of conversation about it being the first, and I'm using air quotes, the first gay novel or the first gay-themed novel to win. And I'm wondering, how did you feel about that coverage at the time? And how do you feel about it now? Because it's such a loaded way. I don't know. I find sometimes when my work gets described that way, I don't always love it. But there's also a sense of pride in being recognized that way.
I think I felt exactly that. Yes, I felt ambiguously about it. It was the first sort of gay-themed book that had won, and I was pleased that it could sort of attract attention on those grounds. But as I've always felt from the beginning, and I just took the decision that I was always going to write from a gay perspective and take that for granted. You know, the gayness wasn't the only interesting thing about the books. They were actually, of course, about all kinds of other things as well. And it was partly a newspaper thing. It was a search for a headline or something, an extreme simplification of something which was much more complex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is so much of it just about what can fit within the limits of the top of the arts section, I suppose, yeah, right? Yeah. Or these days, it's more what's good for search engine optimization, you know?
Precisely, yeah.
Yeah. It's funny, yeah, you mentioned these are gay-themed novels. It's not just that they're gay. The characters are often gay, their sexuality or how they grapple with, you know, being gay in a world where that is outside the mainstream, even today, is so much of it. But these are also novels that are generally political. I mentioned before we started recording, my best friend's master's thesis that he did on your work was about the political element of your work and sort of the relationship between sex and politics. And I'm wondering, you know, we've seen this kind of mainstreaming of the gay experience in that it's something that straight people now also sometimes read books about. And I'm wondering, you've spoken so much in our conversation about writing these outsider perspectives. Do you feel like the queer experience or writing from a queer perspective is still inherently outsidery? Or is it outsidery in a different way than it used to be when you started writing?
I think it has changed. I think when I started, the gay novel was a phenomenon, an important one, which had political urgency and salience, and it was doing something new. It was opening up whole areas of experience which really hadn't been written about in kind of literary fiction before. It was recording the kind of exhilaration of liberation, and then very soon afterwards it was sort of dealing with the whole crisis of AIDS, which itself, of course, changed in all sorts of adverse ways the political situation. So it was something which was, born out of strong political, historical moment. Social mores, understanding, everything has changed so much over the years since. And gay experience, queer experience itself has been, as you say, so much more absorbed into what one might broadly call the mainstream. So the sense that one was writing in a sort of fenced-off, separate area, marked gay fiction, has really sort of dissolved since then.
That was sort of my thought on it as well. And of course, I can only speak from my perspective as somebody who didn't live through, for instance, the AIDS crisis, didn't live through criminalization, lived through the fight for marriage equality, but I was young while it was happening. I wasn't involved in it. And it feels to me that the way in which gay perspectives sometimes are outsider perspectives now, it's not so much that, as you say, gay fiction or gay writing is walled off in a separate area where you're writing to the community, but that it's almost an outsider's perspective in that you're writing to or speaking to the straight world. And so rather than being an outsider in the sense of being fenced off, you're an outsider in the sense of being a minority in the mainstream is sort of how I see it, which can be maybe still political, but also sometimes feels depoliticized to me in a way. Like, I'm interested to know, I guess, if you have any thoughts on whether gay writing has become depoliticized at all over time.
I mean, that's the kind of paradox of what you might broadly call acceptance, isn't it? I suppose that it neutralizes the critical outsider voice. It sort of smothers it and then can ignore it. I've never quite known about the political dimension of my own books, and I think, referring back to that period of the 80s when I first appeared, that there was an element of defiance in the context of the kind of anti-gay backlash caused by AIDS and various bits of Thatcherite anti-gay legislation and so forth. It seemed to me all the more important to be defiant at the time. And though the book isn't at all about politics, it had a sort of political presence and urgency about it. Of course, there's a political dimension to this new book because it's partly about Brexit and is framed chronologically by the early 60s, the time when Britain was first trying to join the European Union and the disastrous vote at the end to leave it. So it's overt politics are more of that kind. But I suppose running through the narrative, there is a changing picture of the relations of increasingly sort of liberated, prominent, out gay people.
Mm-hmm. There's this sense, and I don't want to spoil too much the ending. Obviously, Brexit is not a spoiler because we all know what happened in real life. But things kind of don't end on a very uplifting note, I would say. It's not this constant march of social progress. We're ending during the very beginning of the COVID pandemic and lockdown, where I think that there was a real sort of turning away from social progress in some quarters, that there was this sense of suspicion towards the other and anyone who was different. Did you feel that you learned anything or developed in any way kind of thinking about the fragility of social change writing this novel? Because I feel myself, in this country, and certainly from what I read about UK politics surrounding queer and trans issues, there's almost a bit of social backsliding that's going on.
I'm extremely aware of how vulnerable the freedoms of equality and so on, which we take for granted, and how vulnerable they are to being politicized, demonized and taken away. And I think one sees this a great deal, I think, in the United States, where with an incredibly right-wing Supreme Court and so on, which seems ready, indeed almost eager to destroy so many of the legal societal achievements of the last 50 years. So, I feel very far from complacent about those things, and with the great rightward tilt of politics all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Alan, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
That was my conversation with writer Alan Hollinghurst about his latest novel, Our Evenings. This episode was produced by Lisa Matthews with help from Barb Carey. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. A big thank you to the radio techs who work on this show and to the CBC Books team who handle all things digital, social, and more for us. And speaking of social, CBC Books is now on TikTok. You can follow us at CBC Books. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.